Tripta, let's go.
Namaste and greetings. I, Tripta Behra, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Learning. We are gathered today for day 1 of a 3-day immersive online legal awareness and certificate training program on women's rights, laws, and policies in India. This training course is organized by IMPRI, Gender Impact Studies Center, GISC. Let me now give you a background of the program. The principle of gender equality is enshrined in the Indian Constitution. In its preamble, fundamental rights, fundamental duties, and directive principles. It not only grants equality to women, but also empowers the state to adopt measures of positive discrimination in favor of women. Within the framework of a democratic polity, our laws, development policies, plans, and programs have aimed at women's advancement in different spheres. However, there still exists a wide gap between the goals enunciated in the Constitution, legislation, policies on the one hand, and the situational reality of the status of women in India on the other. For instance, crimes against women are constantly on the rise, and the existing laws are not enough. Additionally, one of the major elements hampering women's rights progress in India is the chronically low level of female political representation. India is emerging. However, the degree to which women and girls are hampered in their ability to fully participate in the society can prove detrimental to the country's modernization. Hence, this timely 3-day course will provide the participants a nuanced perspective on women-specific laws and policies in India, which need to be more inclusive and stringent. This program will focus on laws with respect to women's health, marriage, inheritance, succession, and property rights as well. This course will be conducted by various expert resource persons comprising academicians, advocates, where women's concerns and issues will specially be addressed and reflected vis-a-vis enforcement of rights, concerned laws, and sectoral policies. The chair for the program for today is Professor Vibhuti Patel, visiting distinguished professor, IMPRI, and eminent economist and feminist scholar. The distinguished resource persons have great experience gained in the field along with their expertise. Our experts for this course are Professor Dr. Saumya Uma, Advocate Sanchita Ain, Professor Vishal Narain, Advocate Dr. Albertina Almeida, Dr. Amar Jisani, Ms. Urvashi Prasad, Advocate Dr. Shalu Nigam, Professor Vijay Lakshmi Nanda, and Dr. Nivedita P. Haran. We are very grateful to our expert trainees and Professor Vibhuti Patel, as well as our organizing team for spearheading this timely training course on the pertinent topic of gender equality. I welcome all of you to this enlightening deliberation and thank you for being interested and putting your time, energy, and efforts into understanding emerging issues concerning the impacts of policies in promoting gender equality and helping us to bring together the practitioners and participants through this course for impactful policy research and action. We have also shared the course outline and reading resources in your email for your kind perusal. Before we start today's session, I would like to remind the housekeeping rules once again. Please join the meeting on time. There will be a Q&A session after each presentation. Kindly share your questions in the Q&A box. The questions must not be posted as an anonymous attendee. Ensure that your questions are precise and refrain from making general comments in the question to save time. Now, without further ado, let us start with our program. It is my honor to invite Professor Vibhuti Patel to start the program with her opening remarks. Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, I think you're on mute. Could you please unmute?
Thank you, Tripta, and good evening, friends. First of all, I would like to thank IMPRI team for making an effort and great effort of reaching out to various colleges and universities for a grand success of this program and seeing to it that more than 150 participants from all walks of life, not only lawyers and students and academicians, but policymakers, journalists, citizens organizations are also represented. And today we start our function by offering tribute to two great personalities. One, Mary Roy, who opened the doors for fight against discriminatory family laws, who passed away, and Rajni Iyer, who also was a very important lawyer who took up a lot of cases of family courts and also the major debate on restitution of conjugal rights we had. She was a public intellectual and supported women's movement in a great way. So we remember them fondly and we will continue their legacy of fighting for women's rights. The Indian state has always been considered to be proactive so far as the legal safeguards for women are concerned. The provision of protection of women is key concern in the gender-sensitive legal luminaries of our country. And in the civil, criminal, and labor laws, we see the legal reforms have been put in place. Moreover, affirmative actions such as reservation of seats for women in local self-government bodies, preferential treatment for women entrepreneurs, or free and subsidized education, health facilities, they create an enabling environment for gender justice and gender equity. Now, there are two routes to assert for women's rights. One is a judicial route and other one is a legislative route. And Indian Parliament debated the Towards Equality report in 1975, and for the first time, women's concern came center stage, and government came up with a series of crucial laws and policies and the legislative provisions and the government rules and state-specific laws also came into place and got enforced over last 40 years. Globally, if we see that India played a very important role during the decade 1975 to 85 International Women's Decade, and also the concluding conference, which came up with a visionary document called Nairobi Forward Looking Strategy in 1985. Indian delegation of over 800 representatives from women, various parts of India and the women's movement. They also were very vociferous in formulation of NFLS. We also had a Shram Shakti report in 1988 in which women's movement, trade unions, peasant organizations, all of them contributed in data collection. And we also had a national perspective plan for women in 1988 to 2000. So in 1993, during Vienna conference of UNHRC, where the slogan "Women's rights are human rights" was raised, and after that, the decision to take up programs from 25th November to concluding in a 10th of December, that means for 2 weeks of violence against women campaign, that was also launched. Indian representatives played a very important role, even in Beijing conference in the platform for action, that document that was prepared. And India adopted the Indian Parliament adopted Women Empowerment Policy in 2001, which also touches each and every aspect of life cycle of women from womb to tomb. India's commitment to Millennium Development Goal and the commitment to Sustainable Development Goal is also backed by this important legacy of assertion of women's rights from the bottom-up approach, that is the women's movement's pressure, and then you have a series of legislations and also several policies which are taken up, whether it is about the gender equal financial inclusion policy or gender responsive budgeting policy or financing for transformation, and currently the recent debate which are going on about the feminist foreign policy. So judicious implementation of constitutional guarantees and protective legislation for women is a major challenge. Even Baba Sahib Ambedkar had told us at that time that we need to change the mindset of people, because India has one of the most progressive constitution. But when existence of constitution itself is a threat, that means we have a lot of work to do in terms of reaching out to people. So the mindset of criminal justice system, judiciary, civil society, women themselves, who have a baggage of patriarchal value system and misogyny, and that needs to be challenged. We need to challenge the socialization process and the kind of media messages that are reaching to people. They also generate anti-women prejudices. So with this perspective in mind, the Impact and Policy Research Institute has launched this course for citizens from civil society groups, women's groups, educational institutions, legal activism, and research institutions. And that's with this overarching concern, these 9 lectures are organized. And now I think we are going to have a first very important lecture about the macro perspective on Indian women's movement and their engagement with laws and policies by a renowned feminist and the legal activist, Professor Saumya Uma. Over to Professor Saumya.
Yes. Tripta, you can introduce, ma'am.
Thank you, Professor Vibhuti Patel, for your kind words. And actually, my topic for today is women's movements, Indian women's movements, and their engagement with the law. I'm just sharing screen and starting the PowerPoint presentation. Professor Vibhuti Patel is, of course, much more, she has been in the women's movements for a much longer time, and she has written a lot on women's movements and their engagement, including books and articles. So, and she also, in her introductory words, she has also given, in a nutshell, the work of the women's movement. So what I will be doing in the next, it's 5:20. How much time? This session ends at 5:45, right? So I have about 20 minutes.
40 minutes, ma'am, 40 minutes, no issue.
Okay, so I have 40 minutes including Q&A.
Yes.
Okay, so let's say around 20-25 minutes, and then we can have a discussion. So in this 20-25 minutes, what I'm going to do is to try and elaborate some of the points that Professor Vibhuti Patel has already highlighted, and add a few more. And I will also try to touch upon some historical aspects of women's movements, because very often we are familiar with the contemporary issues. Of course, even the contemporary issues require a lot of discussion and elaboration. But we are much more familiar with the contemporary issues. But I want to take us down the memory lane very briefly to look at historically at how the women's movements in India have engaged with laws. As Professor Vibhuti Patel has already said, two of the major forms of engagement have been seeking recourse, seeking redress from courts of law, and seeking legislative reform, seeking law reform through the legislature, and working on campaigns and advocacy initiatives towards law reform. So these have been two of the major strategies. But within that, there are many things that the Indian women's movements have done, and I would like to highlight some of these since this is the introductory lecture in this 3-day training program, and I hope to be able to set the ground for some of the other sessions where there will be discussion around sexual harassment at workplace, sexual violence, and so on. So why talk about the women's movements at all? Firstly, it gives a sense of history and belonging. Many of us, we know about maybe from the nationalist movement onwards, but even in the independence movement, the standard textbooks in the schools and colleges, there's very little that's actually written about the role of women during the independence movement. But before that, there's even less information that we know. So in one way, knowing about the women's movements gives us a sense of history, a sense of belonging. We also then understand how and what issues were raised, why were they raised at the point in time when they were raised, what have been the opposition, what have been the challenges, what have been the achievements. And also we get a sense of the widespread or broad-based nature of participation. One of the things that women's movements are always told is that it consists of a bunch of elite English-speaking upper middle class women. That's one of the critique about the women's movements in India. But in the images that I show and in the issues that I bring out, we will see the broad-based nature of participation and the widespread nature of the issues that the women's movements in India have raised. And knowing about the women's movements and their engagements with the law also will get us to appreciate the history of struggle behind the rights that we enjoy today. Many of the rights that we enjoy today, we have taken it for granted, but our foremothers and our grandmothers have fought for those rights, and they've struggled, and it is a fruit of their labor that today we have these rights that we enjoy. So it helps to have a sense of history in that sense as well. Of course, there is no beginning or end in terms of the women's movements. Wherever there has been subordination, violence, discrimination against women, there has been individual resistance, and whenever there has been a collective resistance where women have got together and they have identified that this is the same experience of violence or subordination or repression or discrimination that I am going through as other women, then there have been collectivities and collective protests, and those have been really the beginnings of the women's movements. I would put down here 4 distinct phases of the women's movements. I'm not trying to say that before the social reform movement, there was no women's movement. There were probably women's movements even then, but we don't really have much of documentation, systematic documentation on that. So in terms of systematic documentation, what we have is the social reform movement, which was in the 1800s to early 1900s. Then we have the nationalist movement, which was the movement towards independence of India. That is from early 1900s till 1947. Then a post-independence era, from the time of independence till the 1970s, and a 4th phase, which is the post-emergency or the contemporary period. This is when there were 2 watershed moments in Indian history. One was the emergency and the aftermath of the emergency, and also the Mathura gang rape case, which led to the women's movements actually coming together and raising their voices against a very important issue. So these are 2 watershed moments in the 1970s, which I would consider to be the contemporary period. Of course, this periodization is not very, it's not cast in stone, but it's just a kind of a rough periodization for us to have a sense. So in terms of social reform movement, we have, I'm sure we know about the agitation against Sati, which was led by Raja Ram Mohan Roy, and the argument that was made then was that Sati has no shastric sanction, so there was no real sanction from the Hindu religion. We also had widow remarriage as an issue in the early 1850s, which was led by I.C. Vidyasagar. And the strategies were that the argument was that widow remarriage was accepted in the Hindu scriptures, and there was a campaign called Marry a Widow campaign. Of course, this campaign was not very successful, except in terms of virgin widows who were very young, who were then whom men came forward to remarry, but given the obsession with chastity and virginity of women, the older women who were widows, they were not really, they were not successful with a remarriage. But we did have a Widow Remarriage Act, a new law which was enacted, and this law also dealt with property rights of women upon remarriage. Then women's education was an important aspect in the social reform movement, and there were many schools for girls which were established, home education for women because of the existence of the Parda system, where women could not really go out of the house to the schools. There was home education as well, which was conducted, and this women's education as an issue of social reform movement really helped in terms of the second phase, because women's access to literacy and education improved, and women got exposure to new forms of knowledge, whether it was reading, writing, English, maths. Of course, if we look at the course contents of what they studied, a lot of it was home-related responsibilities, whether it was embroidery, cooking, polishing furniture and things like that. But we had this access to literacy and education for women in a concerted way, and this came to be institutionalized through schools for girls, and that helped women prepare themselves to take over the leadership role from the second phase of the women's movements onwards. Because in the first phase, in the social reform movement, although there were women involved, a lot of the leadership was by men. These were men who were educated in other countries. They came back to India, they saw the plight of women, and they felt that this had to change, and they challenged the kind of discrimination and the institutionalized patriarchy. But from the second phase onwards, women with more education, literacy, and access to information, they took over the leadership from the second phase onwards. Women's education, the initiative, one of the main people was Jyotiba Phule, but along with him, there was also Savitribai Phule, Fatima Sheikh, Anandibai Joshi, Pandita Ramabai. All of them were involved in looking at women's education as a major aspect of social reform movement. I'm just sharing the photos of a few of the women in the social reform movement. You may be familiar with some of them. Anandibai Joshi, for example, is the first female doctor from India. There was also religious reform, and this religious reform in the 1800s took place not only in Hinduism, but across all religions. But within Hinduism, there was the attack on caste hierarchies and caste-based structures and priesthood. Some years ago, we had a very important judgment from the Madras High Court, saying that women were eligible to become priests, and women could become priests just they had an equal right to become priests as the men had. Before that, some decades ago, we had another landmark judgment which said that priesthood is not limited to only the Brahmin caste, but priesthood is a position which should be accessible to all castes. So these are some of the ways in which the campaigns influenced both the judgments as well as legislative reforms. Of course, when we talk about Hinduism, not only about caste hierarchies, but untouchability was a big issue. We know just a few weeks ago where a small boy in Rajasthan was killed because he took water from a pot which he was not supposed to touch. So untouchability continues till date, but from the 1800s onwards, the fight against untouchability has been a very, very real one. And of course, much later, we had the Untouchability Offences Act, we had the Civil Rights Offences Act, and then in 1989, we have the Scheduled Caste, Scheduled Tribe Prevention of Atrocities Act. So in a sense, it's a long way that we have traveled from the time of countering and questioning untouchability as a practice within Hinduism and questioning the caste hierarchies. There was also a focus on factory legislation, because this was the first time when there were many factories which were set up in India, and there were long hours of work, exploitation of labor, very little time given for rest. There were very poor facilities available in the factories for women. So, the facilities, like even toilet facilities or childcare facilities, requiring break for nursing one's own child. So these are aspects which were fought for during the social reform movement onwards, and regulating a maximum number of hours of work timings for women. And of course, at that time, when there was a restriction in the work timings of women, this is because of a concern that these women had house responsibilities, and and so, who will cook and who will take care of the children and the elderly at home if they are involved in the factory work for such a long time. Today we will look at that, and we will say that that's again a very patriarchal concept. But the nature of demands and the rationale behind those demands have also changed from time to time and context to context. Then we move on to the nationalist movement, which was from the early 1900s to 1947. Of course, Gandhian mass movements, all of us are familiar with that, where Gandhiji was responsible for getting women, drawing women out of their houses onto the streets and asking them to join the nationalist movement. In a way, this countered women's proper place as the home alone, because women came into came across and into the public space. They saw many things, they learned many things, whether it was protests, dealing with the police, dealing with the army, strategizing for the nationalist movement. So there was a lot that women experienced at that time. But there was also an essentialist construction of femininity, women as patient, women as tolerant, and women as self-sacrificing. So Anupama Roy talks about this essentialist construction of femininity during the nationalist movement. But we cannot ignore the fact that women's public participation was really, the catalyst for that in many ways was Gandhiji and his call for women to take part in the nationalist movement. So I'm just sharing some of the pictures around the nationalist movements and women's participation of the same across various states, in fact. And women at that time also asked for equal political rights and reforms in family laws. These were also aspects that that women within the nationalist movement did talk about. These are photographs of women in salt satyagraha, civil disobedience movement, where women are having a confrontation with the police and the army. Remember that these are women whom maybe a decade ago, a few years ago, they probably were not having the kind of access to public space as they've had during the nationalist movement. This is a boycott demonstration, boycott day demonstration. Some of the women in the nationalist movement, I'm just, of course, there were many women, but I'm just highlighting a few. I'm also highlighting these women to show how an essentialist construction of women is something that these women countered. So Beena Das, for example, who tried to shoot the governor of Bengal, Shanti Ghosh, who was sentenced to life imprisonment. Then we have other women, Durga Bhabi, a contemporary of Bhagat Singh, Matangini Hazra, who was 72 years old, and she was shot dead during the Quit India movement. And these are more women who took part in the nationalist movement, because in the nationalist movements as well, a lot of the discourse is around the male leaders, but we don't hear much about the women. And these are the 15 women who shaped the Indian Constitution. So they were part of the Constituent Assembly. The picture has 11 of them, but there are names and details of 15 of them. Now, very quickly, I'm going to move on to the post-independence era. In which the focus was on principles of equality in the public as well as private spheres, economic independence, questioning gender-based structures that subordinated women. And in the earlier era, there were symbols of daughter, and this symbols of daughter and symbols of Mother India is a symbol that comes to our mind from the independence era, from the nationalist era, and this came to be replaced with the working woman as the symbol. And there was inclusion of sex equality, affirmative action in the Indian Constitution, Article 15, which is a very, very important provision, women's franchise, inclusion of women's rights into radical social movements of that time period as well. Issues taken up were, for example, the Telangana movement, where the question was about land reform, Hindu law reforms in 1948 to 54. As we all know, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar initiated the Hindu Code Bill, but that could not be passed as laws, and then it was split into 4 different laws: Hindu Marriage Act, Hindu Succession Act, Hindu Minority and Guardianship Act, Hindu Adoption and Maintenance Act. And these were then passed. There was also participation in agricultural reforms, policy planning, organizing parliamentary democracy, and so on. In the 1960s, we see spread of Mahila Mandals. And in the 1970s, there was the Sharda movement. There was anti-alcohol agitation, anti-price rise movement, Chipko movement. These are some of the movements. I'm just going to share some photos with you. This is the anti-price rise agitation. This particular picture is from Mumbai, where you see the women having a balan or a rolling pin in one hand and a dalda tin in the other hand. In a way, these symbolize the essential food items for which the price had risen, but by hitting the balan on the dalda tin, they also made noise and called other women. This was a time when we had no emails or mobile phones, so this was also a way of gathering more women and collecting support, while also giving visibility to the agitation itself. This particular anti-price rise demonstration is from Gujarat. We see women-led demonstration in Gujarat as well. And this one is from Bihar. I'm sorry, the photo is not very clear. These are photographs of the Chipko movement, which was really a movement to protect the environment, protect trees from being cut off. So in a way, the women understood the importance of the environment, and they countered the policies which were anti-people, anti-environment and anti-people. So we see even today this kind of a movement, although we don't call it Chipko anymore, but then this kind of a movement to save the environment, particularly from corporate actors, continues, whether it is in Niyamgiri or in other places. This is a picture from an anti-alcohol agitation in Himachal Pradesh. Although I'm showing you this, it doesn't mean that I really support this form of accountability or justice. Now I'm moving on to contemporary era, because we have little time, and I really want us to focus a little bit. How much time do I have for the presentation? Accordingly, I would.
Another 5 minutes or so.
Okay, another 5 minutes. Okay, so in 5 minutes, I'm just going to give you shots of the contemporary era where there was criminalization of specific forms of violence against women, contesting inequality within the matrimonial home, women's control over their lives, and a broader understanding of equality and discrimination, where we find the aspect of intersectionality coming in. So it is not looking at women as a homogeneous community, but looking at how multiple identities, multiple marginalized identities can make the women more vulnerable to discrimination and violence. One of the triggers, as I've already mentioned, was the Mathura rape case, where a tribal girl, underage, I mean, she was a minor girl. She was taken to a police station in Maharashtra, and she was raped by 2 police officers at the police station while her family stood outside. And this case went right up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court judgment called her a liar. And they cast, the Supreme Court cast aspersions on her character because she was habituated to sexual intercourse, because she had a boyfriend with whom she left the home. So that became a trigger, and there was an open letter which was sent to the Supreme Court by 4 renowned academics, and that in a way marked a new, the contemporary era. This was also the era after the emergency. So during the emergency, many organizations had to go underground, but after the emergency, there was a formation of autonomous women's groups which were independent of political parties, and they took up many issues as well. So I'm just going to highlight the issues, and as I have little time. So the anti-rape campaign is one of them, where there has been a lot of rape law reform from the 1980s onwards, including on custodial rape and so on. Agitation against dowry and domestic violence. So we had section 498A inserted in the Indian Penal Code for the first time as a result of all of this, and also the Dowry Prohibition Act, which was already there, that had further amendments to make it address the ground realities. We had campaign against religious fundamentalism. This was during the Ram Janmabhoomi movement, and also because of the Shah Banu judgment and the kind of opposition to that judgment which came in at a national level. demanding women workers' rights, whether it was in BD factories or it was in textile industry. This was something which the contemporary women's movements did in the 1980s and 90s in a large way. And recently, with the labor codes coming in and the possible implications on women's rights, there has again been a lot of discourse around this issue. Agitation against sati and also Dalit women's rights came up as a result of understanding the intersectionality in terms of women's movement. Struggle for a safe environment, campaign on health, campaign against sex selective abortions. So as a result of this, we had a law on PCP and DT. I think one of the sessions in this training is going to be on this issue. Despite having a law, several years later, an organization, a health-based NGO like Sehat had to go to the Supreme Court to get directives to have this law implemented. So getting a law is only part of the struggle. Having an effective implementation is also a very, very important aspect, and women's movements have worked hard at it. So they haven't really stopped at getting a law enacted. Even on domestic violence, we see PWDVA Act 2005. We see the kind of rigorous monitoring of the act which has been going on from year to year. Struggle against state repression, so against Armed Forces Special Powers Act, against militarization and sexual violence. We see in Kashmir, in Manipur, in Nagaland, in many places. Campaign against draconian laws. Campaign for reforms in Muslim family law. Recently, we had the judgment on which prohibited triple talaq and declared it to be illegal. But after that, we also had a criminalization, and even within the Muslim women's movements, there were two different positions which were taken: one supporting the criminalization and one opposing it. So we see that there are these very healthy kind of different positions. It's not that's the reason I keep referring to women's movements as movements and not in the singular, because it's not one voice, it is multiple voices. Sometimes it is different positions, and that really makes the movement a very rich and democratic one as well. Campaign on communal violence bill, which did not see the light of the day, but there were some provisions related to sexual violence in communal context, which was included in the 2013 amendments to criminal law, particularly to the provision on rape. Anti-CAA, NRC, NPR protests, and I want to point here that it was a very inspirational kind of an initiative, which were with a leadership of Muslim women, and it used a constitutional framework, whether it was reading the preamble or citing constitutional provisions to talk about equality and non-discrimination. And of course, Shaheen Bagh is the most famous one, but what happened in Shaheen Bagh was replicated across many states and many cities as well. Indian women in international conferences. This is my last, second last slide, and we see that Indian women in international conferences were able to influence and inform the policy reform at the international level as well. So the limit of Indian women's movements has not been restricted to the country alone, but whether it is taking part in CEDAW related proceedings or taking part in, the Durban conference, which was on racism, or, taking part in the UPR, Universal Progressive. I'm sorry, I forget the full form, but the whole UPR cycle, in which every country is made accountable once in 4 years before an international forum. So women's movements have been taking part in this as well, in order to be able to bring the concerns of the Indian women to the international forum, and to look at possible ways of state accountability in all of that. So in a nutshell, the achievements have been in law, policy, as well as institutional reform. And institutional reform is something that the women's movements have been working hard on. The embedded patriarchy, casteism, communalism in all the institutions, whether it is the judiciary, police, or other institutions. Also, Indian women's movements have been influencing policies, from the 5-year plans to the census and national policies. And of course, we have also had reports on the status of women. We have had 2 major reports, one in the 1970s and one more recently. Law reform is a product of struggles of women's movements and effort to amplify women's experiences, and acknowledgement of those experiences in law, because law has been male-centric. Laws have been made with a patriarchal lens, based on male experiences. So how is it that gender concerns can be brought, and this can be incorporated into the law, so that the law acknowledges the experiences of women, which may be different from that of other genders? So that is one of the major efforts of the women's movements in India. And in terms of institutional reform, creation of special cell for women and children in police stations, women's homes, bringing about accountability of the judiciary, educational institutions, National Commission for Women, State Commission for Women. So these are some of the ways in which institutional reform has also happened. So just to conclude, I would say that the Indian women's movements have worked on law reform, policy reform, as well as institutional reform, but we have miles ahead before we can sleep. And although there have been some achievements, the challenges before the women's movements in India are also formidable. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for such a delightful and enlightening session. In the interest of time, we can move on to the Q&A, and there are 2 questions I can see. Professor Patel, can we take up the 2 questions, if I may?
Yeah, please go ahead, take up the question.
Okay. So Jagrati Shankarji asks, so much work has been done, has been carried out throughout our history for women's rights, but we do not teach it to our children in school. As a result, not only educated men, but many educated women also do not appreciate the hard work that has gone into women's rights campaigns. Have there been any efforts in including this in our school curriculum?
Yeah, very important.
Thank you for your question. I think there have been efforts at including this, particularly with regard to women's role in the nationalist movements. I think there has been a lot of effort that has gone in. Other than that, even in the textbooks, which show these very, very gender stereotypical pictures of the father sitting and reading newspaper, mother cooking in the kitchen and taking care of children. And in the children's textbooks, when these are the pictures that children see, they tend to think that this is the role that that my mother and my father should be playing. And women's movements have addressed this, and they have questioned it, and they've said that these are pictures that have to be changed. So I think there has been some amount of effort. Perhaps this effort needs to be strengthened, and it needs to be more concerted, because it has now become very fashionable for even, for young women to say, oh, I'm not a feminist. So and they think it's very cool to say that, without even understanding the meaning and the impact and the implications of feminism. Feminism is not against men. Feminism is against patriarchy. But many young women do not even understand that, and they say, I'm not a feminist, and and they want to look really cool doing that. So I think there is a lot of education that is required, and whether it is in the schools or colleges or universities, part of it, as far as the teachers are concerned, the responsibility is to make the students unlearn and then learn. Because a lot of unlearning needs to be done, given the propaganda and given the discourse around women's movement, saying that they are, they break families, they are anti-men, they are male haters, and all of that. So I think unlearning and relearning has to be done, and I think there are many teachers also in this forum, and I think it's our responsibility to be able to do that at all levels of education.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that wonderful answer. We take up one more question. It says, women's movement in India have always been fragmented in the sense that issues of urban women are different from rural women. Like you talked about intersectionality. But even when the issue is common, like domestic violence or marital rape, women in India have not been able to raise their voice collectively and have proper law implementation. What do you think could be done to mass mobilize women and educate them to rise against such issues?
I won't completely agree with the question that women have not been able to raise their voice collectively. I think there has been a collective resistance against domestic violence, against all forms of violence against women. Where one may differ is in terms of strategies. But, we can't really, to say that women have not collectively raised their voices, I would have difficulty in really accepting that. And I think it is very, very healthy for the women's movements to have different voices. Why does everything have to be one person, one vote, one voice, one woman? I think it's important for us to have this diversification, and it's important for many women to be leaders on many issues. We have many women taking up leadership. We also have women leaders of the movements openly challenging each other, disagreeing with each other, which is such an important culture in a democracy like ours. We have forgotten, in many ways, we have forgotten to dissent, we have forgotten to disagree. And I think the women's movements have really kept up that spirit of dissent and disagreeing. Even within the movements, there's so much of churning and so much of brainstorming that happens. If it comes across as, oh, women's movements are splintered and they are not speaking in one voice, that's fine. Women can speak in many voices. It doesn't have to be one person representing the entire women's movements in India.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that. We'll take up the people who raised their hands. Miss Lily Grace, you can take up your question.
There are 16 questions in the question box.
Yes, ma'am, we'll take these two
Yeah.
first.
Okay. Yeah.
Lily Grace, are we here? If not, then Kirti Sri Lakshmi, we can go ahead with you.
Hello, ma'am. Thank you for the presentation. It was wonderful. I come from the academic world. I'm a PhD student. So I want to understand, were there any moments in the history which were done by women in research or academia in particular? Because even today I see that posh exists, but or gender cells exist, but they're not taken seriously. They don't need. So I did my environmental law diploma from law school. So it's just not like my institute. Across, like when we students meet up, we kind of get to know this, and it's very unfortunate. So is there anything which was in history or what to do to address this?
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you so much. I'll just answer very briefly. I think Professor Vibhuti Patel will be a better, she is more equipped to answer this question. But let me just flag that there have been, there have been women's studies which have been set up in universities, and that whole movement towards setting up women's studies, towards establishing it, towards running it, is because of women in the academia wanting to take up these issues. So while women who are activists were on the field doing the work, going to police station with the woman who has been sexually assaulted, or who has gone through domestic violence, we also needed women in the academia who would take up who would take up research in a very, very academic way. And that kind of that interlinkage between women in the academia and women as activists has been a very, very important aspect of the women's movements. I'm not saying that there hasn't been tension. Of course there has been tension. There are times when women in the academia have felt that women activists are only acting, but they are not thinking. And there have been times when women activists feel that, oh, women in the academia are only all big words, but there's no action. But there has been a lot of very, very concerted work by the academia and activism within the women's movements. And I think that's a very, very important aspect. For example, if we look at the disabilities movement, we actually have disability studies which in certain universities has been initiated by women who have been in the women's movements. And on the other hand, we have disability rights organizations which do a lot of grassroots level work with women with disabilities. So that's just an example. But maybe Professor Vibhuti Patel may be able to add on more to your question.
In the interest of time, we'll take one more by Rajiv ji. Rajiv sir, could you please unmute and ask your question? Do we have Rajiv ji? If not, then we can move on to the next speaker. Meanwhile, if Professor Uma, if you could be kind enough to answer the Q&A box, we'd really appreciate it.
Sure, I'll do that.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Advocate Sanchita Ain, Advocate on Record, Supreme Court of India. Ma'am, could you please take it up from here?
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I thoroughly enjoyed, before you say something and before I see Professor Uma leave, let me just first acknowledge that I thoroughly enjoyed your session, ma'am. Really, it took me back to my PG Diploma in Women's Studies days when I studied the entire movement. And while I was participating in activism in the campus, that academic base helped me a lot. Reading about the movements, how X happened, the life we lead today, how did we get to live that? It not only motivated but also helped, guided us in our path. Thank you so much. Should I begin with the session?
Yes, ma'am. Are you sharing your screen?
Yes, I'll be sharing my screen. Right. So I will be careful about the time. I'll try to leave as much time as possible for the questions. If we can just resolve these, then we can see the next questions, if the admin can do that. In the meantime, I think you all can type the questions while we are talking about it. I can also take the questions in between if I feel like, or we'll address it at the end. So we are going to talk about the rights of survivors of sexual violence in the criminal law. I've used the word violence here so that because we generally talk about it as violence, we don't always differentiate between an offense and violence, right? What is the difference? Should there be a difference? I think ordinarily speaking, there shouldn't be a difference, so it's fine to call it sexual violence. But of course, we are going to restrict ourselves today to criminal law, because after the 2013 amendment, you all would know a lot has changed, right? And therefore we will be uh, first we will understand how what the procedure is, and perhaps after that we'll come to the substantive parts. I'll try to go slow. So sexual offenses. Now, what is an offense? So offense would be anything that is punishable under the Indian Penal Code. It is punishable. So there will be an investigation, the person will be sent to jail. Right. Also, all of these offenses are cognizable, right? The sexual assault offenses, the sexual offenses are all cognizable, and therefore there will be an FIR, etc., that we are going to discuss in a while. Now, for me, it's important that right at that stage. So, what would you do if it happens to you or you are the first responder? So it's very important to understand that at that stage, it doesn't matter if the act is, some people say it's small, some people say it's big, it may be aggravated sexual assault, it may seem minor because of the conditioning that it's a minor sexual assault. Compared to it, it's minor, but all the survivors or victims, right? It doesn't matter what to call them. For me, it doesn't matter, because if you are in a state of victimhood, you can be in that state, right? Then I feel that there is no compulsion for you to show that you are brave and you are a survivor, etc. No, it's okay to feel like a victim, right? So at that point, you need psychological, you need medical, you need legal support, right? So therefore, with the time, there are mechanisms that have developed, and of course it's so much up to us to see that it's enforced the way it's meant to be. So we of course do struggle with that mechanism a lot many times, but let us first understand what they are, right? So firstly, what questions do you ask? Since we're also going to have sessions on domestic violence, we're going to have session on sexual harassment or at workplace. Therefore, you will understand the scope of those laws when you do those sessions. But right now, of course, first you need to understand what you want, right? You want to send the person to jail, etc. Again, there is no moral obligation. It's important to understand if someone has committed theft and I don't want to report it, I don't want to report it. But given the conditioning, given the kind of, it's seen as a shameful thing to have happened to a woman, etc. Therefore, I feel this is a stage where one should also think of counseling, right? And we will come to that in a while. And therefore, counseling can help you. So if you think you're not in a position to think through and answer these questions, then this is a stage when one should see a counselor as to what would give me a closure, right? So all these questions you would need to look at while you're going for counseling, it also empowers the person. So sometimes people say, I don't want to do anything, it's fine. I don't want to get into all this. Again, counseling helps at that stage, and that's why it has been emphasized so many times. It can empower a person as well, right? So in Delhi, of course, you have Delhi Legal Services Authority. They have people who go to the houses and they, provide whatever support they need, psychological, legal, all of them. There's also one-stop center scheme of Government of India where you get these kind of supports. So the other day, somebody called me from Rampur and she had visited One Stop Center and she was quite happy and satisfied with how they were counseling and how they said, we'll provide you with legal support as well. Though I feel sometimes even people who deal with these survivors, their conditioning can also affect how they're advising the person. Sometimes if it's between, if it's in a family, then they would try to say, it's okay, don't report it to the police. So that has always been my fear. But of course, they sometimes also pressurize the person to, in this case, of course, they were husband and wife, so they were pressurizing him to give her a one-time settlement, etc. Right, there are helplines, there are NGOs, right? There are specific helplines of NCW, there are helplines that deal with sexual assault, right? And there are many NGOs as well who have these kind of helplines, right? Legal support again. There are legal aids. They can be even these NGOs, etc. They can put you in touch with someone. So it depends who you are, who is the first responder, who you are contacting, all of this. But it is possible to get good support during, and it's necessary to get that kind of support at the very beginning. I've seen of course, Delhi is different. You may be at different parts of the country. Sometimes people think, oh, sarkari vakil won't be good. But I have seen the legal aid lawyers in Delhi handling rape cases and sexual assault cases, POXO cases. Some of them are really good, right? So depends. Okay. So as I said, there's one-stop center scheme that comes from Ministry of Women and Child. Procedural aspects. So as I was saying, first you need to register an FIR. These are all cognizable offense. Do you really need to go to the police station? Of course, you can call 100. They can come, right? And you can get your statement recorded. That will be your complaint. It's not necessary to give it in writing, but I would suggest it's best to give it in writing because then you don't miss out anything. Because this is like a first information that you're giving, and it's given as soon as possible, right? Why is it given as soon as possible? So that you don't have time to concoct it, you don't have time to color it, right? Therefore, if you can give the complete facts, that would be useful. So you do not know the law to write a complaint, but you need to ensure that you're giving complete facts. And if it has happened to you or another person, sometimes it's not easy to write by yourself. You may want to skip a bit of it. A part of your memory may be blocked. So it's useful to take assistance at that time, right? Um, right. And then the other thing is sometimes you may first need medical help. So you need to be able to prioritize at that time, which is the first thing you need, right? So then if you need medical help, nobody will say that why didn't you first go to the police, right? So you first go to the hospital. They are bound to call the police, right? In case they don't have one there, they will call the police and the police will record your statement, right? Um, then comes your, of course, they also get your, if they send you to hospital, if you go to the police station, you contact the police, they'll send you to the hospital to get your MLC done. MLC is medical legal case. So what will happen? They will, so there is a protocol. I can take you through it in a while. So where the there is very specific requirement that all of these evidences need to be collected by the health personnel, but uh, okay, we'll come to them in a bit. What all to include in a complaint? As I said, you need to include all the we say facts. It's basically you narrating what happened. How do you know the accused? Since when? Right? Mostly they are known people, so therefore you need to say, tell them how you know. If you omit that, then that will be used, though it may not weigh against you to that extent, but it's better to write the entire facts as they are, right? And also to be very specific about what has been done exactly, right? It's difficult, and therefore perhaps if you give it in writing or ask someone to write, it's useful. Okay, I'm talking like I'm addressing you all as you, because it's essential to know. It's a very, very powerful tool for you to use it, to know about what rights you would have if you're sexually assaulted or if you are a first responder, right? I think there's so many cases that don't get reported these days. The most cases that are reported are those where, like relationships going sour, or someone made a promise for something and then you found maybe the guy is married or something, and then you register a case, right? These cases are common. uh, Family members doing it are common. It can happen to anybody. We never want it to happen, but I think it's good to know what the law is. Then with awareness there will be more reporting, there will be more conviction. It will act as a deterrent. Do the medical professionals need to take consent? Yes, they need to have uh, informed consent before they examine you, right? Um, so they need to get evidence. To get evidence, of course, they may have to do internal examination as well. They'll first ask you if they can do it, right? Of course, a person has every right to refuse, but then it may mean that at the trial you won't succeed because there is no evidence for it, because of your refusal. Um, of course, the accused, again, you need to insist that the accused is called and his MLC is also done, right? So if there's semen, etc., all those samples can be taken. Okay, so what kind of evidences? We'll go through it in a while. I'll take you through the protocol, right? Protocol needs to be followed. Can a doctor refuse to treat the survivor? No. Answer is no. All hospitals, public or private. So it's not that you only have to go to government hospital for treatment. For treatment, I'm talking about treatment. Of course, as far as evidence collection is concerned, you prefer a government hospital, right? Uh, and sometimes the police will refer you to the nearest government hospital. So, but for treatment, every public or private hospital, no matter who is running it, they have to immediately provide first aid, they have to immediately provide medical treatment, all of it free of cost, right? And they shall immediately inform to the police about such incidents. So you don't have to think about going to the police first, right? And then the police can also put you in touch with the legal aid lawyers. The police can also put you in touch with the counselors, right? Um, okay, punishment of maximum 1 year. Can a police officer refuse? So once your MLC is done, can a police officer refuse to record an FIR? No. Right, so of course, under CRPC, police officer is anyway under an obligation to register an FIR if it's a cognizable offense. I think most of us know that. But for sexual offenses, if they don't register, then they can be also punished from 6 months to 2 years. Right? This is after the 2013 amendment. How often can I be called to the police station? Answer is you cannot. Police cannot call you to the police station. Police cannot call a woman witness or a woman victim to the police station for the purpose of investigation. He has to go to her residence to record a statement or whatever queries they have. So now this will clear up the myth that women generally get very scared that we'll be called to the police station very often, etc. You won't be called, right? And this is actually in the law, right? And if they do, they will be punished. So it's not just for arrest, right? Like women cannot be arrested after sunset, even for calling a woman victim, woman survivor, woman witness. They can't be called to the police station, right? Of course, if you voluntarily go to give a complaint, etc., you can do that. The second thing is when they come to record it, the initial complaint that you're making for the FIR. So it's very important that you are able to talk about it, right? You're comfortable to tell the person that this is what has happened. And it's of course easy when you have a woman police officer or a woman officer. Therefore, there's a provision which says that only a woman police officer or woman officer has to record the complaint for registration of FIR, right? And it has to be videographed, right? So this is the stage of FIR. If you have any questions, you may write it. If you have any, you may even raise the hands at the stage of FIR if you have any questions. If you've already asked your questions, you may just put your hands down so that it's easier. Right, okay. Then comes your statement once the FIR stage is done. Then comes statement under 164 CRPC. Right. So in cases of sexual assault and POXO cases, even if a child goes missing, there is a statement that's recorded under 164 before the judicial magistrate. Why? Because then there is a law which says it has to be recorded as soon as possible. So you have an FIR and then the magistrate is recording. For example, if the police has not recorded it properly for XYZ reason, then you also have an opportunity to do it before the judicial magistrate, right? And he'll not do it in open court. He'll take you inside, he'll ask you questions, he'll get it recorded, right? Now it's important for you. That's why I say just write the entire thing in your complaint when you are filing the FIR, because then later on they are going to compare all these documents together. And this is where this is how either you'll win the case or you lose the case, right? Being a lawyer, I'm talking about winning, losing, because if you decide to file an FIR, you obviously want the person to be convicted. Therefore, it's important that the initial document itself is complete in itself. It doesn't matter whether you know the law, you're using legal language. You don't need to use a legal language, but it should be complete as far as the facts are concerned, right from how do you know the person to exactly what all happened that led to this, and exactly how the person committed the crime, right? Then comes what to keep in mind while recording 164 statement. So therefore it always helps even when a person is going to file the complaint. I'm on the FIR bit, right? Because that's the most difficult part, right? So it always helps to go with a certain person so that that person can also fill in, right? That person can also, and since it would be a woman police officer, she can also ask questions, very specific questions, and get it. But sometimes they won't. Therefore, if you write it down, even if you ask someone to write it down, that's fine. You put your signature and you take it, right? The same thing you need to keep in mind that your FIR version and 164 should not contradict each other. So that's important. What happens generally before recording of 164? When I sometimes I'm on the panel of DCW, Delhi Commission for Women. So they have so there's an NGO which has an rape crisis cell that's funded by Delhi Commission for Women. So they get the information. So the counselors first attend them. They inform us that the 164 is going to be reported, is going to be recorded on so and so date. It's mostly after a day, right? And we first speak to the survivor and ensure that they are not scared, etc., whatever, so that they can give the statement properly. This is the stage we also move for interim compensation. What is interim compensation? So basically, there is a compensation scheme that has been established. We can talk about it in a while. So every sexual assault survivor can claim that. Of course, other people also can, but specifically for this, there are nodal officers, etc. There's reporting that's happening as to how many people have received the compensation. So compensation is given based on what sort of medical help you continue to need, the kind of mental trauma you have had, your age, in POXO cases, for example, age matters a lot. If it's penetrative, then of course you get more. If it's sexual assault, still people file. Maybe you won't get as much, but you get something. So it's as a matter of practice, it should be filed, right? And therefore, at this stage, perhaps having your own counsel, doesn't matter who they are, right? Can help, right? So you need to get legal support for this as well, because prosecution is not going to file it, but you need to see whether you have the support of these kind of lawyers there, then they can file it on your behalf, right? And still I have seen that there are people who get their own lawyers because they can't trust lawyers who have been appointed by legal aid, etc. So therefore you'll have to uh, take a decision at this stage itself. Now this is your 164 gets recorded. So this interim compensation application is going to the legal service authority, right? It's not going to the judge at this stage, right? And then comes your investigation. For POXO, it goes to the judge, right? Now comes your investigation. Investigation would start the moment FIR is filed, right? Uh, Now, an IO will be appointed. Some of us are acquainted with the investigation procedure, but the thing is, again, they can't call the victim to the police station, right? And the investigation, how much time? Because generally people have this notion that investigation will take such a long time, etc. Now, after the amendment, the investigation has to be completed within 2 months from the date of FIR. But the problem is, even after these amendments, when the police does not do it, then they kind of get extensions, etc. Right? But the law says within 2 months. Bail, now this is also the time when the accused will be applying for bail, so it's advisable to have your own counsel. And who will oppose the bail on grounds like there is a threat to your security, etc. So all of this, but these matters go to fast track courts, right? Why? Because the law says it has to be heard on a daily basis. It's not possible to hear on a daily basis, but there are special courts, and these special courts are more sensitive. They're supposed to be more sensitive. In Delhi they are, I don't know about other places, but so even if a survivor is making those submissions by herself, the court is bound to hear her. So they are sent notice, and they can themselves come and say why the person should not be given bail, right? So even if a prosecutrix come and says that he has threatened me, so and so has threatened me, right? So therefore he should not be granted bail. Now sometimes bail will still be granted, or there are no such facts and therefore bail is granted. Once I remember a judge saying that he can do stuff from inside as well, whatever. So bail granted. Now if he does something, the other day I got a bail cancelled. If he does something, you can use that to get the bail cancelled, right? If he sends, in that case, he had sent WhatsApp message, the photograph of this chap had sent photographs with some other girls, etc., to the father. It may not mean anything, still that helped us to cancel the bail. Okay, so now I have straight away gone to the evidence stage. Why? Because where, at what all stages would the survivor or the victim would be required to be present, before the police or before the court? So to understand this, because sometimes what happens, the survivor is not prepared enough because they don't know how many times they have to go. I'm handling a case of cyber stalking, and the woman is like, I have just got the case. She contacted me. She's a friend, and she says they keep asking me to come. I thought that I filed a complaint and I'm done, right? You file a complaint with cyber police, and you're like, I'm done, right? This is how it happens, that now the prosecution will handle the case, etc. Why am I being asked to come again? So it's important to understand at what stages would you be required as a witness, right? So before police, of course, police can have, while it's investigating, they may have concerns, etc. They'll come to you to record statements, etc. Right? Before that, I said 164 is getting recorded immediately, so that you don't have to carry that, go through the trauma again after a while. It's getting recorded immediately, so that it's likely that you will be able to recollect and say the exact facts that you have written in the complaint. Once that is done, investigation takes a while. Then you are required, of course, bail, you get a notice, you get to oppose it. Evidence stages when you're required to come to court. And the fast track courts, as I said, there are special courts for this. And there is something called, and the accused is made to sit behind a partition or a panel, right? So that you don't directly have to face the accused. And then your statement, right? So in case of POXO cases, it is recorded in the vulnerable witness box, and in cases of in these kind of cases as well, it can be recorded if the survivor is in a, once I was dealing with the case where we couldn't ascertain the age of the survivor, and also she was in a mental state where we could not say that whether she is um, in a mental state to give the evidence or not. So she became a vulnerable witness. So those witnesses, for them, there is a special room. Again, how many states have implemented, how many states haven't, I don't know. But the law says that for vulnerable witnesses, there should be a special deposition box where they don't get to see the accused, where the questions are not asked to them directly. So in POXO cases would be when there is a child survivor. So it's very hard for them if they are looked into eyes and they're being asked questions by the accused lawyer. It's very hard for them to depose. And therefore, there is a mechanism where they sit in the room, there's a mic, there's a camera, there's a support staff, a lawyer mostly, who will then who will have the who will be able to listen to the accused lawyer, not the person, the victim cannot directly hear the lawyer, right? And then she'll ask question and the victim will respond over the mic. So it's like she doesn't get to hear whatever is happening in the courtroom, what sort of arguments are happening for a question, no, you can't ask this, no, I want to ask this for XYZ reason. All of that the victim cannot hear, because it can be very, very traumatic experience. So one needs to prepare the witness to go through this process, right? So preparing the witness becomes very important, and what sort of, how the other side would be cross-examining. Sometimes the judges don't know how to stop because they also have to give them a right to cross-examine. So one needs to be prepared. The other thing that they do to harass a witness, that again one needs to be prepared for, and the lawyer particularly needs to be prepared for, is when they move an application, once the evidence is done, then they move an application to re-examine, as happened in Uber case. It happens so often, to re-examine the prosecutor for XYZ reason. Now, one objects, and one should ideally object to those kind of applications. Sometimes judges refuse to allow as well, right? Compensation, then finally, once the case is decided, conviction happens, so the final compensation you can claim, right? You have already got into him, and again you can get. Why? Because there's a scheme of National Legal Services Authority for compensation to rape survivors, right? It's like an application that's sent to the Legal Service Authority. Can the identity of the victim be disclosed? For certain kind of sexual offenses, rape, etc., sexual assault kind of offenses, it cannot be disclosed, right? Anyone who prints or publishes or any matter which may make known the identity of any survivor. So, for example, if a documentary is made and for whatever reason they tell the name of the college or whatever, so people can find out who that person is, then again there's a maximum punishment of 2 years. Can previous sexual experience or character of survivor be used against her? The answer is no, right? The answer is no. Why? Because this law says so. You cannot, right? They keep making efforts to bring in, to ask questions on previous sexual experiences, and that you have had sex with so many people, what they did in Mathura case. Now, that cannot be, those kind of questions itself should not be allowed to be asked. And for that, your lawyer, see, the problem is prosecutor may or may not protest. Your lawyer need to be there to object to such questions. Therefore, it helps to have one's own lawyer. Character of survivor, right? Again, that's not relevant at all. It should be objected based on the grounds of relevance, right? Then comes your, and it happens all the time. It happens. Substantive aspects. So we've done the procedural bit. If you now we will just look at the provisions. So rape, we understand that the definition has been broadened now. So it's not just penetration of into the vagina, mouth, right? So it's not just penetration in the vagina. So it can also be mouth, urethra, or anus, right? Uh, and then what else can it be? It can be insertion of any object, right? It can be an object as well, right? Other than penis. Manipulation of any part of the body of a woman so as to cause penetration into the vagina, right? Like people used to do all that. Once there was a case where a doctor had done, and he knew exactly when to stop, so he stopped there, and it was not raped, and he accepted it in open court that yes, I knew, and therefore I stopped just before that. So now even that will be included in the definition of rape, right? Manipulation of any part of a body so as to cause penetration, right? If he applies his mouth to her vagina, anus, urethra, or makes her do so, right, with him or any other person, that's also rape. Now, so you understand the definition has been broadened. On many occasions, we don't know the definition. We sometimes just know that it has been broadened, but we don't know exactly what is the definition. So this is it. Then comes your consent of woman. So if you would notice that, right. So then comes your consent of the woman invalid under the following circumstances. When consent has been obtained by putting her or any person in whom she is interested in fear of death or hurt. So that's not a valid consent, right? So for anything, if you put her under threat of fear, then of course it's not a valid consent. If someone else also, it's not a valid consent. When the man knows that he is not her husband and she gives consent because she believes him to be her husband. When she is unable to understand the nature and consequence of the act to which consent is given due to intoxication, right, it's not a valid consent. Administration of any, like they have those rape drugs, etc., again, it's not a consent, or due to certain mental unsoundness, she cannot give her consent. The other thing to remember of is that consent, what is consent? Consent can be any sort of, it can be voluntary, it can be by non-verbal communication as well. So consent definition, of course, is broad enough, but just because a woman is not physically resisting, and it's there in the law, just because a woman is not physically resisting does not mean she's consenting to it. Earlier, we just had a presumption. We had a presumption after Mathura rape case, which said that if a woman says that she has not consented, then there will be a presumption that she had not consented, and it is on the accused to prove that she had consented. Now, what has happened? They say it very specifically that just because you have not she has not physically resisted does not mean that she's consenting to it, right? That presumption is also there. Okay. Unnatural offenses, so again, there can be, so unnatural offenses, again, we keep saying 377, so it's not like the entire 377 has gone, right? So in these kind of cases where there are two male victims, right? Sorry, there are two men and one of them is a victim, then of course it's unnatural. So it comes under this provision 377. um, and again, there are cases where there is some sort of unnatural sex that's happening. Then again, it comes, if you remember the case where the woman was menstruating and therefore it was said that it's not rape. It comes under a natural offense, right? Then comes your outraging modesty. If a man assaults or uses criminal force or any woman with the intention on any woman with the intention of outraging her modesty, right, or knowing that it is likely to outrage her modesty, right? So even touching a hand, that's applying criminal force under the law. If a man utters any word, sound, gesture, exhibits any object with the intention that it is heard or seen or intrudes the privacy of a woman. So the definition is quite large enough. So if somebody even gestures anything, people flashing their penis, etc. So that's outrage honesty, right? Then comes your sexual harassment. If a man makes physical contact and advances, demands or requests for sexual favors, shows pornography against the will of a woman, or makes sexually allured remarks. Those kind of innuendos also come under sexual harassment. So you'll be doing posh later on. If it happens at the workplace, you also have that as an alternative, but it does not mean that you cannot file a case uh, against him. You cannot initiate criminal action against that person. You always can if any of these things happen, not necessarily just a physical contact, it can be any of these, right? Disrobing, if a man assaults or uses criminal force against a woman with the intention of disrobing her or compels her to be naked. Again, um, touching the hand would amount to using criminal force. Taking the dupatta off, that would amount to disrobing, right? It's not necessary disrobing would mean going naked. It can be this as well. Voyeurism, again, this is an important provision. If a man watches or captures the image of a woman in a private act or disseminates such an image, he shall be punished under the section. Now, this happens so often when a woman, with her consent, has got it recorded just for fun to watch it later. But and it may be a recording, it may be an image, right? uh, but it's kind of circulated without the permission of the woman. So in one such case, what had happened, a student had contacted me at 2 a.m. like through someone. They said, we only know you who's from so and so place, so we thought we'll contact you. Now we don't know what to do because this girl has just you know she was about to commit suicide because her ex-boyfriend had put it on an escorts website, and she didn't know how to talk about it. She was feeling very, very ashamed of herself, right? So that's why I say I emphasize so much on the significance of counseling at that time, because at that time I didn't have the chance to kind of connect her to a counselor. So I had to kind of talk her out of it, and I had to kind of take her from that place where she was feeling so powerless and helpless and shameful. How would she talk about it? What would she tell her father? um, from there to this place where she started thinking in terms of what should she be doing. That's why it's important to have these laws in place, because then it's also empowering to know that you can do all of these things in that moment. It's empowering to know this, right? A private act includes an act where the victim does not expect to be observed by the man, right? Or any other person at his behest. So sometimes it can happen in a trial room, etc., where people can have cameras, or someone, like from a distance, you may have forgotten to switch off your light, etc. So it's not your fault, right? It's important to understand it's not your fault if that has happened. If a woman has consented to the capture of the image, but not to dissemination, right? Again, to make this understand to people at that time, when they're feeling so ashamed that why did I allow him to record it in the first place? Now people will think I'm a bad woman. Because of our conditioning, we all tend to go into that space at that time. Still, the dissemination will be punishable, right? And there will be provisions attracted from Information Technology Act as well. So if you have not consented to circulation or publication, then the person cannot do it. As simple as that. Stalking, if a man follows, so for example, if you have some nude pictures in your laptop and you give laptop to someone to work on it, and they find it, they take it and they circulate, voyeurism, right? And since there is a criminal action against it, more and more people are feeling, there's so many men who say that, they feel everything is so punishable that they can't think of doing anything, which is exactly why the law is in place. Of course, should it be made gender neutral? That's in the discussion. Of course, it should be, but are we yet ready for that stage? I think the power structure is still such that we are not ready, right? If a man stalking, if a man follows or contacts a woman, recently we had an incident, right, where a stalker killed a woman. So let's first read the provision. If a man follows or contacts a woman or attempts to do so despite a clear indication of disinterest by her, or monitors the use of internet, email, or other electronic communication by her. So it can be cyber stalking or it can be actual stalking, right? So in that case, also it's punishable under criminal law. Why? Because it's not just because it may lead to something. Now this is something that has happened at our conditioning level. That the other day I was judging a competition where we were discussing privacy, and everyone was saying that if they misuse that information, then it would be privacy. Then it would be violation of my right to privacy. But if someone's recording me all the time, won't it be violation? So therefore, just stalking in itself is a violation of my right to be the way I want to be, right? To have my own private space, to have a space where I can grow, to have a space where I can exercise autonomy. This itself is a crime. So just because it may lead to a crime later on, that's why it's an offense? No. It is an offense in itself. It's important to understand that. Of course, it has been made an offense, perhaps because so many stalkers were doing things and the police was not even recording a complaint of those stalking instances. Yet, stalking in itself is a serious crime, right? Then comes sexual intercourse by husband upon his wife during separation. If they're living separately, so though marital sex is not recognized, but if they're living separately and they have sex without her consent. So some people read half of it or know half of it and they think, oh gosh, this is such a provision, it goes against husbands. No, without her consent. Because even if he does without her husband and without her consent and they're living together, then it's not a crime. But if they're living separately and then he does it without her consent, then it's rape. Now, after the amendment, we also have acid attack included in it, right? So whoever causes permanent or partial damage, right? Just because it's thoda sa, all that doesn't matter. If, acid has been thrown on any part of the body, right? Or acid has been administered to the person in any manner, be it, I don't know if people inject, but even if it's injected or it's mixed with water, whatever, or by using any other means with the intention of causing or with the knowledge that he's likely to cause such injury or hurt, right? Fine, again, whatever fine is payable in this, there is a punishment, and then whatever fine is payable, it goes to the medical expense and treatment, and that is to be paid to the victim. We have a provision of cruelty as well. We all know 490/18. Now, when you do the session on domestic violence, perhaps you can distinguish how this as a criminal offense is different from what we refer to as domestic violence, what sort of relief you have there. What cruelty is as an offense, it's anything that's done, which is done by husband or relative of husband, right? So when the husband or relative of husband subjects kind of does something that is likely. So it's not necessary that the woman has to commit suicide, it's likely to drive a woman to commit suicide. There's a grave injury caused or danger, even if it's a danger to her life, limb, or health. It can be both physical and mental. Now, this is another conditioning. The other day, someone went to the police station with a complaint. They said, no, case nahi banta hai. Why? Because there's only mental cruelty. No. Again, the same conditioning, the cultural barrier that keeps coming up to educate, to raise awareness, even among the police officers, it can be very, very difficult, right? Then comes harassment with the intention of forcing her or any person relating to her to meet any unlawful demand. So for dowry, etc., they may not call it dowry, and therefore it doesn't even use that word dowry. So of course, if it's dowry, then it's Dowry Prohibition Act that also gets subtracted. But along with that, if they're harassing her, trying to force her to get something out of her parents or out of her, then again it comes under the definition of cruelty under the penal code, which means the persons involved can be put behind bars, right? Since the punishment is less than 7 years, there is a case law that says that such people can get anticipatory bail, right? So if it has been registered against you, then of course you can get an anticipatory bail immediately, right? Some people think they have to approach the police, do something with the police. No, if it's below 7 years, you can directly go to the court and get an anticipatory bail. Then comes your right of private defense to the extent of causing death. Now, some of it was already there. First two was already there. Third has been added. So what does it mean? So we all have right to defend our body, right? So if someone's coming to you to with a knife or something, then you obviously have a reasonable apprehension that he may kill you. Then you can use proportionate force to stop the person. Now that proportionate force can be to the extent of causing death, but you won't be charged with murder. You will be charged with culpable homicide not amounting to murder. So it means what? If a person dies, then you will have to go to jail, right? But you won't be charged with murder. You'll be charged with culpable homicide not amounting to murder. Anything short of causing death, of course, you can use the defense of right of private defense, and you can be completely exonerated. But if you have a reasonable apprehension that a person is assaulting me with the intention of committing rape or to gratify a natural lust, or is you have an apprehension he's going to throw acid on you, etc., right? Then what can you do? You can exercise your right of private defense, but I would advise exercise it shorter. I mean, don't cause death, otherwise still you're going to jail, right? What else do I need to cover? Of course, there are aggravated rapes as well, like gang rape, etc. But we can, if it's done by a public officer, then it's aggravated offense. Then the punishment will be more. If you have any questions, we can take that at the moment.
I think you have answered all the questions. There are questions, but I think all that you have covered in your later part of your speech answer. So,
wow, that's great.
Thank
very
you so
good,
much
brilliant presentation.
for that very informative session. Vibhuti ma'am, would you like to give some comments?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think the historical context which Saumya gave, and then you got into the specifics of sexual violence and demystification. I liked your language, such a lucid language with such live experiences that you have. It will be very, very helpful because among the participants, there are so many community-based organizations, human rights organizations, trade union workers, workers, women's rights organization. For them, it will give a practical step by step. You have explained how to deal with the question and all other nuances also, what to do in case of POCSO, whether they can, the Q&A style which you used, I think it was very, very useful. And I know but everyone, for me, it was a refresher. And for, I think, so many participants, it will be extremely useful for their day-to-day work. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Vibhuti ma'am. I think we'll take one question if we can, Sanchita.
Sure.
Okay. So it says, while sexual offenses are covered under law,
Yeah.
sorry. Yes, ma'am. While sexual offenses are covered under law, what about ambiguous situations which stem from a lack of sex education and understanding of consent? For example, male entitlement to sexual intercourse or refusal to wear a condom. How should problems like these be tackled?
That's true. You are right. And therefore, I say we are yet not ready for a gender neutral law. There is a very, very close relation between culture, society, and the law. So law there's a causal relation. So whatever is happening in society, whatever you're aware that yes, this is also a violation. So that's the first step. But not everyone is aware yet. As you rightly said that men are not aware, women are not aware. Right, women are not. They have internalized it over ages that they don't know. They think that their job is to please, right? So I think that kind of unconditioning, that kind of unlearning, because sometimes even I fall in the trap and I may end up saying something that's part of my conditioning. That's why I was using the term our conditioning, because we are responsible as a society. We are responsible, we are part of the society, and we are responsible for what is happening around us. We are responsible to change it around us. And perhaps if all of you can change it, and this is something I keep telling, and I did a refresher course for assistant professors for UGC, the same thing I told them. If you can do it around you, if you can do it in your colleges, if you can do it, I mean, the kind of change that it can bring, right? And that's why I try to address it. If you're a first responder, then what you should do, if all of you can rise over whatever these conditionings are and try to educate people around you, that will take us a step forward. We'll have more such laws, and we'll have better enforcement of the existing laws.
Thank you so much, ma'am, for that answer. I think in the interest of time, if you could please answer the question in the chat box itself. And thank you so much everyone for their patience. We've extended the session a little. So without further ado, I'll call upon our next speaker for today, Professor Vishal Narain, Professor, Management Development Institute, MD at Gurgaon. Welcome, sir. Please take it from here.
Yeah. Thank you. So I understand I have about 40 minutes, right? So the title of my talk is Understanding the Gender Dimensions of Natural Resource Management. So please allow me to share my screen for a moment. Yes. Yeah, can you see this?
Yes, sir, it's visible.
Yeah, and I'm giving it to a full screen. Okay. So the focus of my talk is quite different, I think, from the previous two talks. And the way I have organized it is basically to, since it's a training program, the idea is to develop some kind of conceptual understanding around gender. Though looking at the profile, it seems many participants would already be familiar with some of the concepts, but just to bring everyone on the same page. So I would talk a little bit about like, why should we study gender? Why should we be talking about gender issues at all? What is gender? Conceptually, what is gender? Why should we study the gender dimensions of natural resource management? What is it in talking about natural resources that is gendered, right? And what are the gender dimensions of natural resource management? So what are the different ways in which we see gender plays out, or we see gender differences in access to natural resources, control over natural resources, decision-making processes in the context of natural resources. And in doing this, I would say that the talk is somewhat experiential, that in the sense that I will draw on my own research, my own journey with research on water governance. And I'll use a lot of illustration and examples from what I saw in my research. And I would like to start by saying that, you know, I never started off with an explicit focus on gender. I was never trained in gender. I've never gone through a course on gender and development. I was never a student of gender studies. But when I started, you know, research on water, I found that gender was so basic to water governance, to water management, that it was not possible to look at water governance without addressing the gender dimensions of it. So what I want to say is that gender is very intrinsic to how natural resources are managed, are controlled, are governed, are distributed, are consumed. And I will essentially try to draw on my own research, especially around water, to highlight those. And I imagine that when I went through the list of participants, I saw that many of them were students. And therefore, if students want to, you know, pursue research on gender studies and natural resource management, I would like to give some conceptual points, you know, in the spirit of a training program. And then I'll conclude on with some thoughts on the way forward. So what I was told is that out of the 40 minutes, 20 minutes are for lecture and 20 for discussion. But I would like to split the discussion and the lecturing throughout the 40 minutes. And let me start by asking the participants a question. So when you hear the words equity and equality, what do they mean to you? Is equity the same as equality? Because sometimes we talk of gender equality and sometimes we talk about gender equity. So are we talking the same thing or are we talking about different things? Would any of the participants like to respond? You could raise your hand or you could just raise the tone of your voice. Yes? Yes, what is equity? What is equality? And why do we talk about both the words and not just one?
Radhika ji, please go ahead.
Yes.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
From what I understand, equity would be giving a level playing field, understanding where each person is standing and with what capability each person has. It's not giving the same stand to everyone, but recognizing where we stand and then providing a platform which brings us all to an equal playing field.
Good. All right. Okay. So as Radhika said, that equal is about being treated the same, right? And equity is about fairness, about what is appropriate or just. Okay. So let's suppose that there is a cake. There's a cake and the cake has to be divided in a class of 10 students. So you can divide the cake equally. So every participant in the class can get 1/10 of a cake slice. Right? But some people would say, well, that's not fair because some students come from very affluent backgrounds. They can enter a barista, cafe coffee day, you know, a sugar and spice any day and pick up a slice of a cake or a pastry. And there's some students who come from very poor backgrounds and, you know, they can't afford a cake or a pastry on their own. So why don't we be fair to the class and give the biggest slice of cake to the poorest student and the smallest slice of cake to the richest student? Someone would say, well, no, that's not fair. Why don't we use this as a mechanism to reward academic performance? So a student who gets the highest marks gets the biggest slice of cake, and the student who gets the least marks gets the smallest slice of cake. Someone would say, no, well, that's not fair because the student who has the highest marks already is on top of the world. And if you give him the biggest cake slice, he'll have a bloated ego. And the student who's got the lowest marks is already feeling depressed. And if you gave him this teeny weeny slice of cake, he will go and commit suicide, right? What I'm trying to say is that the concept of equity is a normative concept. It's a value-laden concept, right? And it means different things to different people, okay? So as our participant Radhika said, that equal is about the same treatment, and equity is about a differential treatment in relation to one's needs, capacities, or background. So if you were a gardener, and if you want to water your plants equally, you would pour the same volume of water in all the plants. But if you would want to water them equitably, you would water the plants according to their need, right? So the reason I'm explaining this difference is that gender, right, is one axis of social differentiation along which equity or inequity are experienced by people. Yeah, but it is not the only one. And that is also very important to understand. In fact, I'll argue in a little while the gender becomes meaningful only when seen in relation to other axes of social differentiation. Okay, so for those who are uninitiated, and I expect that some of you may be, that very often for the layman, the words gender and sex are used interchangeably. So when you fill an application form, sometimes it says name, age, sex, and sometimes it says name, age, and gender, right? So if you talk to a layman, he would say, well, no, sex and gender are the same, yeah? But actually, sex refers to, say, the physical differences, yeah, between men and women, yeah? So we say that sex is a biological construct, whereas gender is the social meaning that we assign to these physical differences, right? So gender is a social construct. It refers to the socially defined norms, rules, regulations that describe what it is to be a man or a woman, what man should do, and what women should do. Okay, so and my favorite example of this is that when somebody in your family is expecting a baby, you don't buy the gift until the baby is born. So you wait for the baby to be born. So you say, well, if it's a baby boy, we'll give blue clothes. If it's a baby girl, we'll buy pink clothes or yellow clothes or white clothes, right? But the baby boy or girl don't care. They didn't ask for blue or white or yellow or pink clothes. Yeah, but it's a social construct that, well, boys should wear blue, black, gray, and girls should wear white, pink, or yellow, okay? And therefore, we say that gender is a social construct located in time and space, which means that it is highly contextual. So what is considered to be a man's domain in one society may be considered to be a woman's domain in another society. And what is considered to be a man's domain today may be considered to be a woman's domain tomorrow. So like in my father's generation, for instance, it was very uncommon for a man to enter a kitchen. But these days, it's part of your socially constructed masculinity that you are also a chef. You can cook, yeah. And so many of the cookbooks, so many of the cookery shows are led by male chefs, yeah. So we say that gender relations are socially constructed, but they're also fluid. They change from time to time. They change from one context to the other. And these norms can be sanctioned by state law. So, for instance, state law may prescribe, for instance, how men and women can inherit property. These differences could be sanctioned by religion. So, for instance, in certain religions, women must cover their face with a veil, but men don't have to do that. And in certain religions, men may have to keep their hair long and tie it in a turban, and women don't have to do that. So what I'm trying to say is that these social differences can come from state law, they can come from religion, they can come from social norms and practices, right? And gender conceptually needs to be distinguished from gender identity and sexual orientation. So gender identity is how a person identifies, in terms of whether that person's preferences, behavior, conform to the sex that's assigned to him or her. And sexual orientation is about who you're emotionally or physically attracted to, right? So gender identity, and sexual orientation are conceptually three different things, yeah? And together, they fall under the broad umbrella of gender studies, yeah? So in this talk, I will focus more on gender, as in gender relations, rather than questions of gender identity or sexual orientation. And I'll keep a focus on the gender dimensions of natural resource management. Okay, so why should we take a gender perspective in natural resource management? So there are some points flashing on the screen, but would any of the participants like to share some thoughts? Like, why should we look at natural resource management from a gendered lens? Any quick comments or reactions from the participants? From your experience, so there might be people who have looked at gender in natural resource management. There might be some NGOs working around natural resources. Anyone would like to add?
Yeah, sir. Here.
Yes.
I work on a national park for my PhD thesis. So I happen to kind of, it's an economic study, basically, environmental economic study. But I'd seen that women are more kind of involved in the community conservation.
Okay.
And their attitude towards wildlife. I mean, it's not like my objective to study, but I was always kind of noticing that. that they have a very good knowledge of biodiversity and to preserve species and to kind of, tolerance towards the wildlife conflicts. So I felt, yeah, it's very important area to be studied. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to share?
Rekha ji is here.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I'm from Bihar, and I'm associated with an organization called Kaushale Foundation, and we are working with the community on different issues, including the gender aspect and the natural resource management. So I believe the reason is that the relation which men and women share with the natural are very different in terms of their day-to-day needs and their work. So it's different, and women are more affected by the natural resource status in their community, in their surroundings. So it's important for them. So
Great.
for example, like a very universal example of collecting water. So if there is scarcity of water, then women who are the responsible to collect water, and they will bear the brunt of scarcity of it. So generally, like, this is one of the example, but in most of the cases, it is what impacts women mostly. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Okay.
So we have Debangna ji.
Yeah. All right.
Ready?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think I would like to say that, women, if you look at it, because there has always been the binary, household has always been something that women have taken care of. So women are conventionally at the receiving end. So if you look at, say, who will be getting the water in a remote area, in a rural area, the person who will be traveling to get the water would be women. So in general, it is related to the household work and that part of it.
All right, thank you. Okay, so as we said that, so men and women have a different relationship with natural resources. And I think as all the three speakers, I mean, the three participants have pointed out, so in all societies, there's a gender-based division of labor around natural resource collection, whether it's fuel, wood, fodder, or water. And what I want to say here is that when you look at gender, it is very important to look at gender, without any preconceived notions, right, about who does what. So for instance, I went to the field, with those pictures in my mind of women collecting pots of water on their head, assuming that, it's always women who collect water. But, when I was doing research in a village called Sultanpur, in peri-urban Gurgaon, I found that in the upper caste families, like the Rajput families, it was considered below a woman's dignity, right, to go out to collect water. And in those families, the tasks of water collection were done by men. Okay, so having said that, the point still remains that there is at the household level, there is a gender-based division of labor around collecting natural resources, whether it's fuel, wood, fodder, and water, right? And of course, as most of you said, it is true that in most societies, the effects of water scarcity are disproportionately borne by women because they are the ones who are involved in collecting water for domestic purposes. Okay. The other point, which is also a conceptual point that I would like to emphasize in studying gender, is that gender becomes meaningful as a conceptual entry point of analysis only when looked at in relation to other axes of social differentiation. Yeah. So therefore, the concept of what we call intersectionality is very important because all men and women. So men and women are not a homogeneous whole. Right. So in our society, an upper caste woman experiences the world in a very different way than does a lower caste woman. Right. A widow experiences the world in a very different way as does a married woman. Okay. And therefore, the concept of intersectionality is important. And therefore, when you do, when you want to do a meaningful analysis of gender, you have to look at how gender intersects with other axes of social differentiation. And a very good example from my own research, again, is from the same village, Sultanpur, where I observed the water collection activity. And I found that when there was a lower caste woman in the queue for taking water, so after she filled her pot, and a higher caste woman came to collect water. So she cleaned the stand post because in her mind, the stand post had become impure by virtue of being used by a lower caste woman. Okay. And therefore, it is very important to understand. And there's also the work of Deepa Joshi in North India, where she's argued that it is lower caste women who face the greatest struggles in accessing water. So what I want to say is that gender becomes meaningful only when you look at it in relation to other axes of social differentiation. Like in the West, a Black woman experiences the world very differently from a white woman. Okay, so these different kinds of intersectionalities are also contextual. In our society, caste is more important, but somewhere else, maybe the color of skin is more important, maybe ethnicity is more important. So if you went to Bangladesh, maybe caste would not be an axis of social differentiation, but maybe religion would be, or something else would be. So you have to be careful to look at how gender intersects with other axes of social differentiation. Okay, and also I find that, as I said, that there's no aspect of natural resource governance, access, and control which is not gendered. And in one of the papers that has been circulated to you as part of your compendium, I found that even water supply interventions have gendered impacts. Yes, so if you've read that paper there, what happened was that, it was a mountainous area where women used to climb steep slopes to go to the springs to collect water. And then pipe water supply became available through public standposts. And even though women walked shorter distances to collect water, they did not have to negotiate steep mountain slopes. They ended up carrying more water on their heads because men thought that, well, now that the water is available closer, they could use it for additional purposes. So men who would earlier bathe at public spaces like a village pond wanted to bathe in the privacy of their homes. Yeah. What I'm trying to say is that even the creation of water infrastructure has gendered impacts. It affects men and women in different ways. And for those of you who are working around natural resource management, it might be very interesting to see how the same natural resource intervention, even the creation of any kind of a water infrastructure, affects men and women in different ways. And then there's the work of Georgina Drew, who through her research, she demonstrated that there are even gender dimensions to environmental protests. And she found that men and women both protested against large dams, but both had different kinds of arguments, different kinds of concerns against large dams. And they also had different ways in which they expressed those concerns. So women would sing songs and men would say, "Ye to bas gana gati," and they would, and those voices would get drowned. So there's this work of Georgina Drew. It's a paper in the journal Mountain Research and Development that you can look up, where she talks about how there are even gender dimensions to environmental protests. Okay, the other aspect which I think is important in terms of looking at gendered, the gender dimensions of natural resource governance is about the efforts to mainstream gender in integrated water resource management. So there has been a very popular international discourse since the 1990s. Where we talk about gender mainstreaming. And when we talk about, local governance structures, when we talk about local mechanisms for decision-making, the assumption has been that this kind of gender mainstreaming can be accomplished simply by bringing more women on board. So for those of you who are working, around, say, forming natural resource management committees and forestry, watersheds, water, irrigation, sanitation, the gender dimension of that is really looking at, say, the differences between men's and women's involvement in local governance structures, okay? And in the water sector, this has mainly meant efforts to bring more women on board. So it's been assumed that simply if there are more women in local water management committees, then the goals of widening the net of decision-making among women, get accomplished. But this plays out in very different ways. So in my own research in Maharashtra, for instance, I found that even though you reserved seats for women, they may actually be represented by their husbands or by elderly male relatives. So I was doing research on a water user association in Maharashtra during my PhD days many years ago. And though there were seats reserved on the association for women, they never actually came for the WUA meetings. And they were represented by their husbands. So in a way, we were back to square one. And let me just relate a very interesting anecdote from my research. I was doing field work in a village called Budhera near Gurgaon, and I wanted to meet, the village head. So I asked the local people for directions to the heads, to the village head's house. I went, I knocked, and the lady came out. And I said, "Ki mujhe na pradhan se milna hai. I want to meet the village head." She said, "Well, wo abhi shahar gaye hain, sham ko mil lena. He's gone to the city. you please meet him in the evening. I said, no, I'll come some other time. And I later discovered that she was the village head. She was the village head, yeah. But she always had this in her mind that no, it's her husband who's actually the effective village head, yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that this is so there's more to it than reserving seats for women. And unless you look at look at gender as a form of power relationship between men and women, it really doesn't help you understand what's happening as a result of all these kinds of reserving seats for men and women. Okay, this was one. So other thing is that even though you may reserve seats for women, they may face social constraints to participation. So I had a student many years ago called Nidhi Gupta, and she was working on water and sanitation committees in Gujarat. And she said that again, there was a provision that seats have to be reserved for women, but she found that, that the social norms inhibited women's participation. So it was considered to be against, a woman's, she used the word maryada, like dignity, or it was considered inappropriate for a woman to speak at a public forum. So again, so you may reserve seats for women, but social norms may limit their participation. I had another student, a couple of years ago, Gitanjali Kaushik, and she was also working on water and sanitation committees in Gujarat. And she said that when you look at, say, local governance from a gendered lens, it's not necessarily simply about bringing more women on board. It's rather looking at how men and women can contribute differently to the success of the local governance, processes and mechanisms. So she said that in her Pani Samiti, she found that certain tasks were entrusted to women and certain tasks were entrusted to men. So when it came to, negotiating with the bureaucracy, formalizing procedures, talking to outsiders, that task was done by men. But when it came to something like collecting the water fees, that task was given to a woman because it was felt that women would be more conscientious and scrupulous with money. So she said that there was some kind of a gender-based division of labor, even in the functioning of the local governance structure. And she said that it's not just about getting more women on board, rather it's about looking at how men and women contributed differently to make the local governance processes more effective. Okay. And the other argument, of course, is that people say that when you force women to participate in water management committees, it's just one more thing for them to do, right? So over and above their enormous responsibilities in the farm and at home, it's just one more pressure on their time. And many scholars, many feminist scholars also argue that we need to steer away from this kind of eco-feminist narrative. Yeah, so which says that women are intrinsically closer to nature, which may or may not be true. But when that eco-feminist narrative is used to legitimize, women's greater involvement in local water governance structures without giving them control or authority, that is what is questioned. So it's not about, maybe they say that it's not just about getting more responsibilities on women over and above what they have to do on the farms and at home, but it's about giving them control and decision making, right? So this is the different ways in which the gender dimensions of local governance structures, the gender dimensions of differential contribution to decision making play out. And there's a lot of literature on this. Yeah, so there's a lot of work by Barbara van Koppen, Margaret Swartwien, which goes on, but of course it's not possible to go on and on talking about that. But what I want to say is that it's very contextual, and you really have to look at what is happening in a specific context and what is holding, say, women back from coming forward, or what is it that represents, say, a gender-based division of roles and responsibilities within the functioning of local governance structures. The other issue that I'll briefly talk about, hoping that we still have time, is about the very low presence of women in the water sector in South Asia. And this issue was first flagged by a Saki Water study in 1998, and which found that there were very few women in the water bureaucracies in India, Nepal, Bangladesh, right? And the study identified many reasons for the low presence of women in the water sector. One was the perceived masculine nature of the water sector. So for a lot of people, when you think of water, you think of dams, reservoirs, you think of water infrastructure, hydraulics, right? So the perceived nature of the water sector is that it's an engineering dominated sector. It requires, hydraulic solutions, it requires a design, civil works, etc. Right? And this perceived masculine nature of the water sector, the study identified, has resulted in very few women being present in the water sector, especially in higher positions. Yeah. The other reason was the absence of gender-sensitive infrastructure. So, for instance, safe places for women to stay, access to toilets, which kept women away from field-based jobs, yeah, in the water sector. Of course, there were issues of sexual harassment at the workplace, and many women said that because of personal constraints and family responsibilities, they could not shoulder increased responsibilities in the workplace, and that often held back their promotions. Okay, but this is beginning to change, and the good sign is that because of a lot of interest among donors, funders, research and academics, it seems that in the future, there will be more women in the water sector. And one of the initiatives that I am aware of, and which I've also been closely involved in monitoring and executing, is the SAVA program of Saki Water and IDRC, which essentially tries to bring more women in South Asia into water resources education and gives scholarships at the master's level for women to undergo, training in interdisciplinary water resources research. And so they go training through an interdisciplinary water resources curriculum and then go on to do independent research. So there are conscious efforts actually to bring more women into the water sector, right? Increasingly, there is increasing donor attention to gender issues in research design, execution, and team composition. So when you submit a proposal for a research grant, donors will ask you, like, will there be a good gender balance in your team composition? Will you address gender issues in your research? Yeah. And the third thing which I find interesting, which I think will change the gender balance in the future in the water sector, is the changing nature of water resources education itself. Okay, so conventionally, India's water professionals were produced through civil engineering programs, yeah, which were dominated by male students. So if you looked at the student profile of civil engineering, you would find that there would typically be more male students. But now there are a number of interdisciplinary water resources education programs, like at Terry School of Advanced Studies, at TIS, at Shivananda University. And if you look at the student profile, you find that the gender balance is much more favorable, yeah, in the interdisciplinary programs than it is in conventional programs, yeah, which means that at this point in time, many more women are being trained as water professionals than they have been in the past. So in the future, one would expect to see more women water professionals because of the kinds of issues and initiatives that I'm talking about now. Okay, so, right. So I will just want to take a short pause before I continue to take any immediate questions or comments or reactions. Not questions, but maybe immediate reaction. And then I'll, go on to the last part of my talk. If any experiences you would like to share, anything that I said resonated with some of your experiences, then I would be happy to take that now.
Professor, am I audible?
Yes.
Shantanu-ji, go ahead.
Yes. Professor, I am Shantanu, representing from Foundation for Ecological Security in Rajasthan.
Yes.
I feel a lot of this economics that defines natural resource management are more patriarchal, because when we are talking of water or natural resource or biodiversity, it is always we talk of how much bags of wheat or maize that is produced. Why can't we see how many hours we save in terms of reducing drudgery? So I think natural resources require much more gender sensitivity and gender definitions in actually defining natural resources. More such kind of thought process has to get into it. So
yeah, sure. Thank you. No, that's true. So what happens is that, when you develop a gendered lens, then it expands your way of thinking to look at gender. So, and that's why a training program like this is useful, because it gives you a lens to look at gender, to articulate gender. So for instance, when I teach gender to students who are, who are trained in engineering, it opens up a totally new area, a new way of thinking, because an engineer is not conventionally trained to see gender, to look at gender, right? And once I was, involved in a training program in Rajasthan, in Jaipur, where we were talking about gender rights and equity to engineers in the irrigation department. And Rajasthan is a highly patriarchal state, right? And one of the participants said that, why are we talking about gender? He said that, जो प्रकृति का नियम है, उसे हमें नहीं छेड़ना चाहिए, right? And we explained that there was nothing like prakritik about gender. So gender is a social construct, right? So, right. So I think this is why a training program like this is useful, because it develops your way, a way to look at gender, to be more sensitive to gender, right? Okay, any other quick comment before I proceed to the last part of my talk?
Diana ji has raised hand.
Yes, please.
But I think she has dropped out.
Okay, all right.
Please continue, yes.
All right, so then this brings me to the last, say, 5 or 7 minutes of my talk, which is about changing gender relations. Yeah, so as I said in the beginning of the talk, that gender relations are not static, they're fluid, they change. And when you talk about gender relations around natural resources, especially, for organizations like the previous participant, Foundation for Ecological Security, that do a lot of very grounded work on natural resource access, on governance, it's very important to understand what are the kinds of factors that will cause gender relations to change. Okay, and I will talk about, again, some examples from my own research, going back to that village Sultanpur, where I said that, in upper caste families, it was not women who went out to collect water, it was men who went out to collect water. But what was happening was that in Sultanpur, there was a lot of land use change, right? So a lot of the land had been acquired by the state, by Reliance and so on. And so men were diversifying occupationally. And men started moving to the city to work. So they had not migrated, but they would go, they would move to and fro in the morning and in the evening. And when that started happening, the women said that we would not wait for the men to come back to collect water. And then women themselves started going out to collect water. And the expression they used was parda phat gaya. I mean, the veil has been removed, okay, right? So this is something to look at. So how occupational diversification, how land use change, result in a transformation of gender relations around natural resources. And often in this case, of course, it meant, say, one more thing for women to do, to go out and collect water, okay? The other example I have, again, is from my work in peri-urban Gurgaon. And this is a village called Budhera. And if there's anybody from Gurgaon in this group, you would have read about the Chandu Budhera water treatment plant in the newspaper, okay? So when this water treatment plant was built, they acquired the village's grazing land. And Budhera was a highly livestock-dependent village, and one could also question that from an equity angle, that if in a livestock-dependent village, is it fair to acquire the village's grazing land, to build a water treatment plant for the city? So when the grazing land was gone, many households switched from grazing to stall feeding. Okay, so in our society, the task of taking the livestock out to graze is the responsibility of the man. Okay, yeah, but collecting fodder is the responsibility of the woman. Okay, so when households switched from grazing to stall feeding, the earlier task of taking the livestock to graze, which were done either by men or by professional herders, yeah, so households moved from grazing to stall feeding, which meant that women had now to go out to collect fodder and bring it home. Yeah, and this is an unintended impact around gender relations and an unintended impact of urban expansion. So you acquire the village's grazing land to build a water treatment plant, and it manifests in increasing responsibilities for women around collecting fodder, okay? Yeah, the other thing that we talk a lot about now is the feminization of agriculture, yeah, which basically happens because as men migrate, men migrate from like the hills to the plains, or they go abroad, then women are left behind having to shoulder greater responsibilities managing the farms over and above, the responsibilities at home. A lot of the work from ISIMOD, for instance, in mountain context talks about this kind of a phenomenon, okay? And the final thing, which I think is important to understand now, is the intersection of climate change with resource scarcity and how that increases, again, women's natural resource collection burden. What I'm trying to say is that for those of us looking at gender issues and natural resource management, it's very important to understand the fluidity in gender relations, and then to investigate what are the kinds of factors that will cause gender relations around natural resources to change. Okay, So let me just conclude with some very practical tips. So for those of you in this group who are students, at master's level, doctoral level, who want to do some work on gender. So what are some of the entry points conceptually to do? So of course, a lot of the social science, tends to be abstract and it can be intimidating, but it also is important to demystify, to deconstruct the social sciences so that, students become more comfortable and anxious and eager to do this kind of work. So a few things that I learned from my own work is that when you study gender, you should always start with a blank slate, right? So gender relations are highly contextual. So don't go to the field with any preconceived notion about who does what, okay? The other way to operationalize gender is to ask the who question, like who does what at home and in the field. So what does a man do? What does a woman do? Okay, whether it's livestock rearing, whether it's, collecting fodder, fuel wood, water, working on the fields, okay? And it's all these activities are sustained by a very gender-based division of labor. So then ask the who question, who does what at home in the fields? And then how does gender intersect with other aspects of social differentiation? As I said, that the concept of intersectionality is extremely important in looking at gender, in talking about gender, because women are not a homogeneous whole, and for that matter, nor are men, okay? And then how do gender norms vary across social groups? So you will find, I found paradoxically that gender norms are far more fluid in the lower caste groups than they are in higher caste groups. So higher caste groups, gender norms are much tighter, whereas you would find that they become more relaxed when you move down the social hierarchy. But that's something I have found. Again, your experiences might be different, okay? And then you ask yourself, what is causing gender relations to change? Right? What factors are causing the relative roles and responsibilities of men and women around natural resources to transform? Yeah. And the other thing is, focus on gender relations and not on women. Yeah. So when you focus only on women, you get half the picture, right? But when you focus on gender relations, you get the complete picture. You get an understanding of how roles and responsibilities are divided between men and women, who does what and what is changing. Yeah. So rather than talk about women, take a perspective on gender relations and look at gender conceptually as a form of power relations. Okay. So what are the final thoughts I have? So, gender is about the differences between men and women, and it's not only about women. Yeah. So sometimes when we say gender, we think it has to do with some woman's issue or something like that, okay? So, and I want to say that more men should talk about gender, should be involved in research on gender. And I was not surprised that, among the 10 panelists for this talk, only 2 were men. Yeah. So I think that this should change. So I would like to see more men, talking about gender, doing research on gender, engaging on questions of gender. This is not to say that women are not capable of doing it on themselves. All I'm saying is that gender is about both men and women and the differences between them. So if you want like transformative change, and both men and women have to be involved in the transformation. And I think that the current moves towards interdisciplinarity in water resources education are welcome moves, because not only do they lead to a reconceptualization of the water sector, right? As more balanced and in a more balanced interdisciplinary way, but I think that also creates more women to come into the water sector, and that may provide a greater diversity of perspectives, ideas, in dealing with water-related challenges. So I spoke mainly, with reference to water, since that's where most of my own research experience lies. But I think some of these arguments are generic and would apply also to other natural resources. So I'm assuming that, the 2 papers that were there in the compendium have been read by the participants. And so I may like to use the last 5 minutes just getting some responses from the participants on those 2 papers if they've read them. So the first paper was Shifting the Focus from Women to Gender Relations. It's a paper in the journal Mountain Research and Development. And some questions I would like to throw for discussion is, what does the paper tell us about why we should focus on gender relations rather than on women? What does this paper tell us about intersectionality? And what are the weaknesses of conventional indicators of women's water burden? So if someone would like to share some thoughts around these 3 questions, and if you read those 2 papers, then I think that would be a very good way to supplement the discussions we've had in the last half an hour or so. anyone would like to share any reflections on the paper on the light of these 3 questions? Yes, and for the other paper that was circulated, I had the paper on replacement or displacement. So the questions are, what does this paper tell us about changing gender relations around natural resources? And how does climate change intersect with land use change to influence women's burdens around natural resource collection? So if anyone has any ideas from the 2 papers around these 2 questions, please feel free to share. Or if you have other reflections or thoughts, then we may have some time to take them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir, for that enlightening session. If anyone cares to speak, they may raise their hands and unmute themselves regarding the papers. If not, then ma'am, do you have any comments, any additions to make? I think you're on mute.
So thank you, Professor Vishal Narain, for giving such a comprehensive understanding of political economy of national resource management. I have some 4 points to make. One is most important is that we need to understand from the collective struggles on the livelihood issues in the past, like in Maharashtra, we had a campaign Ek Gaon Ek Panavta, where to fight against the caste-based segregation and exclusion of Dalit communities, Dr. Baba Adav has started this campaign, and he had a very important message. Though there were conflicts, there were backlashes, but still it completely changed the scenario in Maharashtra in terms of caste-based segregation. Second one is that wherever in PRI, Panchayati Raj Institute, I have been involved in capacity building of women elected representatives, both in rural and urban local self-government bodies. We have seen that wherever there is a backing of the social movement to these women elected representatives, they don't have to depend on Sarpanchpati. They are the ones who take decision. And they also, like, I have seen the fights going on in Panchayat where men want water only for tube well or for agriculture or for industry, while women say what we need is a potable drinking water. Even when Karnataka watershed development project, they called me to have a capacity building of the engineers, all these metallurgical engineers and environmental engineers and mechanical engineers and pipeline engineers, they all were talking of commercialized water. They said, oh, but you can buy pouch, no, in 1 rupee. So that was their understanding of water, while women had to really deal with water, no, for drinking and for cleaning and for this. Even at the time of pandemic also, the first protest in all parts, wherever the people in the Bastis came from women, because they were the ones who had to get water in the midst of, like, for the household and for constantly washing hands repeatedly and for even menstrual hygiene and all. Second one is that urban, I think in your this thing, I think you need to include also the urban scenario where the water mafia rules the roost, no? Because that's why we have been seeing, we have had so many, number of demonstrations and this thing, but it is water mafia which doesn't allow decentralized access to water. And I think we need to, you also touched upon the issue of time use analysis, that how much time. Indira Rajaraman's study shows that Indian women spend 6.2 years of their life in just collection of water. So if you relieve them and make potable water or a tap water accessible, at least for 6 years, they'll be able to go to school or use time for their own self-development. So I think this TUS, for the first time, Government of India has given a macro level TUS data, time use data in 2019. They are in public domain. They can be downloaded. That also shows that Indian women on an average spend 10 times more energy goes into the unpaid family work. But I was really highly impressed and I was excellent. You have given a lot of food for thought for all of us to take these issues seriously. And I think your point of more men, in fact, we hunted, we tried so many this thing, but except for you and my husband, I bullied him. So now they are the only 2 people who are there on this gender. But I think gender as a serious concern has to be the priority for the social scientists, all social scientists, and we'll have to lobby for that. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the comments.
We have 2 hands raised, Monica ji and Ahana ji. Monica, would you like to go first? Yeah.
Thank you so much, Vishal, Narain sir. It was pleasure learning so much from you. Actually, in terms of water, I wanted to share something of my experience. I'm from Darjeeling, studying in Sikkim University, and if you see in Darjeeling, we receive the highest amount of rainfall, second highest, first being the Mausamgram Cherrapunji, second is Darjeeling. But still, if you see in Darjeeling, there is acute scarcity of water in spite of receiving the second highest rainfall. And that being the case in Darjeeling town, especially if you see, it is run by water mafias, what we see. They sell waters in the tankers, and that's how the economy runs. And that is mostly controlled by the men. And on the other side, if you see poor women who of course cannot afford to buy water, so they are traveling far away in the natural springs to collect water, and being like, going through a lot of tough time in Darjeeling. Water issues have been a very prominent issues even in elections and other cases, and it's mostly women who have been suffering. So in that case, having shared that experience, I would like to say that the experience that women and men, the difference in natural resources that women and men experience is actually very different, and it's more concerning. For men, it is more of an economy, and then for women, it is more of a basic necessity. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's true. So in fact, Professor Vibhuti Patel also referred to the mafias. So, you're talking about like Darjeeling, and you're saying, so one of the arguments is also how we understand the water crisis. Yeah. So the popular perception of the water crisis is that it's a physical crisis. Yeah. But if you start looking at the different patterns of access, you find that it is, at least in large part, caused by the societal institution, because water is not scarce for everyone. Right, water is not scarce for everyone. It is some people, who experience water scarcity. So if you go to a very dry state, like, I mean, not dry as in alcohol, but if you go to a state with very poor access to water, and you stay in a 5-star hotel, you will still have a mineral water bottle in your room. Yeah, so nobody will say that no, we don't have water in our state, so there is no mineral water. There will still be water in a swimming pool. Okay, so, and that's why I think it's also it's also about how we reframe the water crisis as an institution, as one of institutions and entitlements, rather than a physical crisis. Okay, and so I think some reorientation, some rethinking about because how you frame the problem, right? Your narrative about what constitutes a water crisis drives your solutions to it. So if you see it as a physical problem, you think that it can be solved by building more dams, reservoirs, etc., right? But even with those more dams and reservoirs, some people will still face deprivation. Yeah, and therefore you really have to look at these redistributional issues. You really have to look at why the water crisis exists for some people and not for others. And therefore some reframing of the understanding of the water crisis is required. Yes.
Annaji?
Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, you are. Please go ahead. Please be brief.
Thank you so much, sir, for the informative session. So my question is not specifically on water, but as you were discussing about the natural resource, I wanted to understand like the issue of poaching and illegal trade, I mean, in natural resources, and how it sort of destabilizes the community as well, leading to a certain sense of like poverty. And so is all these aspects also somehow leads to gender-based violence, because access to natural resources gives the woman a certain sense of empowerment also.
Sure.
So like, what's your opinion on that? And second point is that we should also understand how this kind of, I mean, control over natural resources and negotiations that continues, it impacts on familial structures. So in Maharashtra, there is a scenario of water wives. Yeah. Where a man can take like 2-3 wives together to just fetch water for daily use, but then it is somehow actually disbalancing the gender relations and reconstructing it again in a different way. So it's just a comment, but the first one is a question. So what do you feel about the poaching and illegal trade affecting the gender relations?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't have any specific insights on poaching and illegal trade. But yes, I know from a number of studies that that since it's considered to be a woman's responsibility to collect water, their inability to do so is often a cause of domestic violence. So I know from studies in Bangladesh where women are beaten up because they're not able to get water for the household. So yeah, that insight they do have.
Thank you.
Even in Chipko movement, women had reported that after the project started, the arbitrary felling of trees started, the streams and tributaries and all dried up. And women would just walk from one mountain to other mountain, would not get one pitcher of water. They would face domestic violence and they would commit suicide by throwing themselves from the hilltop. No? This was way back in 1972.
Yeah, and I also know that, I mean, there's a relationship between these gendered norms and resource access. So for instance, I know that in some high altitude communities, in order to prevent land fragmentation, right? There was a system where a woman would marry the brothers. So one woman would actually have many husbands, and the idea was to prevent the fragmentation of land. So in that sense, also you can look at a relationship between, say, gendered norms and natural resource management institutions. Yeah.
Haryana.
Thank you so much, sir, for your insights. It was an extremely well-informed session. Thank you so much for your time. I'd like to extend this to a formal vote of thanks. To start off with, I'd like to, as we come to the end of this extremely enlightening discussion, I, Tripta Behra, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, would like to extend my propose a vote of thanks on behalf of IMPRI Gender Impact Studies Center, GISC. We are grateful to our experts for the day one of this training, Professor Dr. Saumya Uma, Advocate Sanchita Ain, Professor Vishal Narain, and our chair, Professor Vibhuti Patel. We had a session on women's rights, laws, and policies in India. We thank all of our participants who have raised pertinent questions and actively participated in today's deliberation. We welcome you tomorrow, September 2, for our day 2 sessions of the training course by distinguished experts, Advocate Dr. Albertina Almeida, Dr. Amar Jesani, and Advocate Dr. Shalu Nikam. We are grateful if you are watching us later on YouTube or listening to us on our various podcasts or reading our publications. We hope you continue to join in the future to our IMPRI #Web Policy Talk and Web Policy Learning. Wishing you all a very good evening. Thank you for sticking for so long, and thank you for your patience. Have a good night.